Venus was branded the family disgrace by her toxic parents, the black sheep blamed for every failed deal, every ruined partnership. They told the world she was lazy, aimless, unworthy of the family fortune. But while they drank champagne and signed shady contracts behind closed doors, Venus quietly pressed record. One hidden file, one careless word, one final betrayal, and their million-dollar empire would crumble at her fingertips. All she had to do was wait for the perfect moment. What would you do if your own family called you worthless to hide their dirty secrets? Drop a comment if you'd expose your toxic parents too. And don't forget, like this story and hit subscribe for more shocking family revenge stories. Venus Bennett had grown up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. Tall iron gates, marble floors, endless dinner parties filled with fake laughter and whispered deals. But behind every polished smile was a threat, and behind every pat on the head was a reminder, you owe us everything. Her father, Charles Bennett, was a ruthless businessman who prided himself on building an empire of real estate and political connections. Her mother, Evelyn, played the devoted socialite, the charming hostess who turned a blind eye while money changed hands under the table. Venus, their only daughter, was expected to smile, obey, and inherit the legacy they built on lies. But Venus was never the daughter they wanted. She didn't want to marry some wealthy heir or sign fake documents to cover her father's frauds. She hated the parties, the backroom deals, the cold way her parents talked about people like chess pieces. When she was 16, she refused to sign off on a fake charity donation her father used to launder money. From that moment, she was branded the failure, the rebellious child, the reason for every crack in their carefully polished image. By 25, Venus had been pushed out of every decision that mattered. Her father told investors she was too soft, too emotional, unfit to lead. When she found a real job as a junior analyst for an independent firm, he humiliated her, spreading rumors she'd stolen company money. The same money he siphoned to bribe local officials. She lost her job overnight. Her friends disappeared with it. Her mother called it tough love. Her father called it business. They never imagined Venus might fight back. One night, a few weeks after her parents forced her to sign away her remaining shares in the family company, Venus returned to her old bedroom. She was supposed to collect her last few things and leave quietly. Instead, she found a box she hadn't seen in years, tucked away in the back of her closet, her late grandfather's old safe. Her grandfather, unlike her parents, had always whispered that she should keep her eyes open. If you ever need to protect yourself, don't trust anyone but the truth. Inside the safe, Venus found dozens of old notebooks, floppy disks, and a dusty recorder. Her grandfather had worked with Charles for years, and apparently, he'd grown suspicious of the deals that never quite added up. Venus started piecing together every scrap of information. Then she did what her father would never expect. She played along. She showed up at family events with a forced smile. She asked to sit in on board meetings, pretending to beg for one last chance to prove herself. Her father laughed. Her mother hugged her, telling guests how poor Venus finally understood her place. No one noticed the tiny recorder in her purse, or the camera on her phone. No one cared when she offered to fetch coffee, sitting quietly in corners while lawyers whispered about offshore accounts, forged tax statements, payoffs to inspectors. Every night, Venus backed up files to an encrypted drive. Every morning, she played her role, the broken daughter desperate for forgiveness. Her parents, so used to seeing her as weak, never saw the steel behind her polite nods. As weeks turned into months, Venus watched them plan their biggest deal yet, a shady land development contract that would funnel millions in fake costs through shell companies. They bragged about it at their parties, clinking glasses while people praised their vision. Venus knew this was her moment. She collected signatures, receipts, wire transfers, recordings, enough to bury them for good. When her father finally invited her to the signing ceremony for the new project, she thanked him with tears in her eyes. He told her this deal would secure the Bennett legacy forever. Venus knew better. This deal would be the last time they held any power over her. When the cameras flashed and the papers rustled under expensive pens, Venus's mind was calm. She only needed 5 minutes. One file, one button to press. Then the world would see what the Bennett family really was, a crumbling house built on lies, and one daughter strong enough to tear it all down. Venus never planned to become a spy in her own childhood home, but the night she cracked open her grandfather's safe changed everything. At first, she didn't know what she was looking at. Scribbled notes, half-finished letters, receipts from decades ago. But as she flipped through the yellowed pages under her phone's flashlight, she saw patterns her parents thought no one would ever connect. The more she read, the colder her hands felt. Offshore bank names she'd overheard in whispered conversations at parties. Code words that matched fake charity donations she'd been forced to sign as a teen. Hidden property deeds linked to shell companies she'd never heard of. But that carried her family's fingerprints everywhere, and tucked at the very bottom, a list of names, local politicians, inspectors, lawyers, all marked paid, loyal, for now. It was her family's empire in ink and paper, proof that every mansion, every car, every fake smile at a charity gala was built on someone else's silence. That night, Venus couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with every memory. The times her father yelled at her for asking too many questions. The moments her mother told her to, "Just sign here, sweetie," and smile pretty. The day they cut her out of the will for embarrassing the family, when she refused to marry a business partner's arrogant son. Her parents had always called her the problem, the weak link. But as she stared at the safe's contents, she realized they were terrified of one thing, the truth escaping their gilded walls. In the days that followed, Venus buried herself in every dusty file she could find. She began recording late-night conversations with family accountants and lawyers who assumed she was too dumb to notice the hush-hush numbers. She scrolled through old emails from her father's personal account, stored on an old laptop she'd once used for homework. There were files hidden in plain sight, bribes disguised as consulting fees, tax returns doctored with fake deductions, invoices for contractors that didn't exist. But the final push, the moment Venus knew she'd never walk away, came one stormy evening when she returned to the house for a family dinner. Her mother greeted her at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her father raised a glass of whiskey, chuckling about the big day ahead, a new contract worth millions, with Venus conveniently invited to watch him do real business. After dinner, Venus slipped upstairs to her old room to back up her recordings. She was about to shut her laptop when she heard voices drifting through the thin walls. Her parents' study door was slightly open. She crept closer, phone in hand, and hit record. "She still thinks she's getting something out of this?" Her father's voice was a sneer. "Poor Venus. She thinks we'll let her back in. She'll sign the papers we need, smile for the cameras, and once this deal clears, we cut her off for good, again." Her mother's laugh was soft but sharp as broken glass. "At least she's useful for once. After this, we'll move the money offshore. If she talks, who's going to believe the family embarrassment? She's nothing." In that instant, Venus felt something inside her snap. For years she'd swallowed their lies, convincing herself maybe, just maybe, they'd change. That there was still a daughter somewhere inside their hearts they could love. But standing in the dark hallway, listening to them plot her final betrayal, she knew. The only thing left to save was herself. She barely slept that night. She triple encrypted her recordings, printed copies of contracts she'd secretly photographed, saved backup drives in 3 different places. She called an old college friend who worked for a small, hungry news outlet, someone who hated corporate corruption as much as she did. They met in a cheap diner across town. Over greasy fries and cheap coffee, Venus slid over a flash drive. When her friend plugged it into a laptop and scrolled through the files, they looked up at Venus with wide eyes. "Do you know what this is?" they whispered. "You're sitting on a bomb." Venus nodded. Her hands trembled around her coffee mug, but her voice didn't. I know, and when I drop it, they won't get back up. Together, they mapped out every step. Venus's friend connected her to an attorney who specialized in corporate fraud. He told her what evidence would stick in court, what might vanish if she didn't move fast. They taught her how to protect herself. Never store all the evidence in one place. Use burner phones. Don't trust anyone offering to handle things quietly. Venus returned home every week, acting like the obedient daughter who finally knew her place. She brought cookies to meetings, played along with her parents' smug boasts about rehabilitating her image. But beneath the surface, she was building a case strong enough to bury them. Her parents planned to sign the final contract at an extravagant ceremony in a luxury hotel ballroom. Champagne fountains, silk tablecloths, local officials lining up for photo ops. Venus knew it was the perfect stage. She only needed to make sure every camera, every guest, every reporter saw the truth all at once. She would not be erased this time. She would not be silenced, bribed, or married off. The same parents who taught her to smile for the camera would discover how quickly a single recording could tear down everything they thought was untouchable. When Venus walked back into her parents' mansion the next week, she looked exactly how they wanted her to look: humbled, apologetic, ready to grovel for scraps of forgiveness. Her mother draped an arm around her for the cameras, beaming as she fed gossip magazines a headline: "Estranged daughter returns to help family legacy." Her father called her his little girl in front of investors, squeezing her shoulder like she was his prized puppet. They had no idea they'd just handed her the keys to destroy them. For weeks, Venus sat quietly at their mahogany conference table while lawyers bickered over the final pieces of the Bennett mega deal, a flashy urban development worth millions on paper, but in reality, just another front to funnel dirty money through layers of shell companies. Her father used Venus's presence as proof of family unity. He needed her signature on one last piece of paperwork to satisfy suspicious partners overseas. And Venus? She needed that fake unity to keep her inside the room. Every handshake, every nod, every whispered aside was a piece of the puzzle she recorded. Sometimes she wondered if they could hear her heart pounding under her silk blouse as she slipped her phone under a pile of folders. She kept her voice calm, her smile softer than ever. In the dead silence of the boardroom, only Venus knew that every lie was becoming evidence, time-stamped, stored, and duplicated twice before she even got home. At night, she'd crawl into the back seat of her old beat-up car, parked a block away so no one could trace it back to her new life. There, she'd plug in her laptop, upload files to her journalist friend, check that the lawyers still had copies. She didn't trust anyone completely, not even her allies. Her parents had taught her better than that. One evening, as her father poured bourbon for his inner circle and bragged about how good it feels to have family loyalty back in line, Venus slipped away to the study. Inside, she found a drawer she hadn't dared to open in years, her father's personal safe. The code was still the same birthday he'd mocked her for forgetting as a kid. She popped it open with shaking hands and found exactly what she needed: raw drafts of offshore wire transfers, blank checks already signed, an entire folder labeled "Hold for Contingency." Contingency. His favorite word for blackmail, bribes, dirt on enemies who might try to pull the same trick he was pulling on them. The irony made Venus want to laugh out loud. She snapped photos of everything: pages, memos, bank routing numbers. When she heard footsteps, she shut the safe, slipped the phone into her pocket, and turned around with her best innocent smile. Her father's right-hand man stood in the doorway, blinking like he hadn't expected to find her there. "I was just looking for the Wi-Fi password," Venus lied, her voice sugar-sweet. "I couldn't get any signal in the guest wing." He bought it. Of course he did. Nobody ever looked twice at the girl they thought was too soft to know what power really was. Back at her tiny rented apartment, Venus spread everything out across her kitchen table: the files, the recordings, the photos, the timeline. She mapped it all with a lawyer's precision and a daughter's fury. The plan had to be airtight. Her parents were masters of threats, smear campaigns, hush money. They'd destroy her without a second thought if she moved too soon, or too sloppy. So she rehearsed it like a performance. She wrote every step in a notebook only she could read. She set reminders for when to call the news outlet, when to send copies to the authorities, when to trigger the final upload that would go live on every platform at once. One leak was a scandal, but a coordinated flood? That was a weapon. For the first time in her life, Venus felt something close to freedom. Not because she was safe yet, but because for once, she wasn't afraid of them. They had made her the scapegoat for every secret they were too cowardly to own. Now she would make them own every secret in front of the whole world. In her old room at the mansion, Venus stared at her reflection in the antique mirror her mother had gifted her at 16, a birthday ruined by threats and tears. She saw the girl they'd raised to be quiet, obedient, small. She didn't see her anymore. She pressed her hand to the cold glass and whispered, "They wanted me invisible. They're about to see me clearer than ever." Once Venus locked down every recording, every scanned document, and every signed paper that could rip her toxic parents' world apart, she knew it was time to push them right to the edge and make them shove themselves off it. She didn't need to sneak around the mansion anymore. Now she made herself visible, on purpose. She attended every board meeting in tailored suits instead of soft sweaters, her hair pinned back sharp and precise. She asked bold questions in front of investors, pointing out discrepancies in numbers that made her father's jaw clench. She leaned in close during late-night planning sessions, pretending to care while she slipped her phone under the table to catch every slip of the tongue. The shift rattled her parents. Evelyn tried to pull Venus aside in the rose garden one morning, pretending to fuss with her hair. "Darling, don't draw too much attention to yourself. Let your father handle the big pieces. We don't want people doubting the family, do we?" Venus forced a soft laugh. "Of course not, Mother. We want everything to look perfect." And she made sure to record every word. The more her parents squirmed, the bolder Venus became. She offered to smooth things over with skeptical partners. She volunteered to help prepare the press release for the grand signing event. In the background, she leaked tiny pieces of information to her journalist friend, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. An anonymous email here, a blurry screenshot there. Small cracks that made the press hungry for more, but didn't spoil the bomb she was about to drop. Her father's closest advisor began to suspect something was off. One night, he cornered Venus in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. He slammed a hand on the marble counter and hissed, "Why are you suddenly so eager to help, huh? You think you're back in the will now? You think Charles Bennett's gonna give you a penny?" Venus looked him dead in the eye. "I don't want a penny. I want what I've always deserved. The truth." Before he could respond, she pressed her phone's screen just hard enough for the secret mic to pick up every syllable of his threats. How he'd ruin her if she talked. How he'd bury her alive in lawsuits and smear campaigns. Perfect. Exactly the monster she needed him to be. Behind the scenes, Venus's lawyer prepared airtight complaints for the IRS, local prosecutors, and the press. The moment the signing ceremony kicked off, the files would hit every inbox that mattered. And if anyone tried to twist the story? Venus had 5 different copies of her recordings pre-scheduled to drop on social media and a direct line to her journalist friend for a live broadcast. It wasn't just about proving her toxic parents were criminals. It was about making sure they couldn't buy silence again. Every guest at that signing event would see the empire Charles and Evelyn Bennett built for what it truly was. A rotting house of fraud held together by bribes and lies. On the night before the signing, Venus stood alone in the vast ballroom where they'd hold their grand finale. She watched workers hang velvet drapes and set gold-rimmed glasses on linen-draped tables. 100 names on the guest list: politicians, developers, greedy city officials who'd pocketed hush money for decades, all dressed up to toast a deal that would collapse before dessert. She felt the weight of what she was about to do, The scandal that would rip her family's name off every marble plaque they'd ever paid to engrave. For a split second, old fears crept in. What if they turned it all on her? What if no one cared enough to watch the tapes? What if power won again? But then she remembered the voice in her head, her grandfather's soft rasp when she was little. The only thing that beats power is truth, Venus, even if it breaks your heart to speak it. She opened her phone one last time, scrolling through the folders. Years of secrets in neat digital lines. One click away from freedom, for herself and for every innocent person her parents stepped on to get rich. When the doors opened the next morning, Venus would be there, standing behind her father's shoulder as he bragged about the future, smiling for the photographers Evelyn had paid to capture her return to the fold. And when the last contract slid across the polished table, Venus would press play. The empire that fed off her silence would choke on her voice. The morning of the signing, Venus stood in front of the grand hotel ballroom's gilt-edged mirror, adjusting the simple black dress her mother had insisted she wear. Evelyn called it elegant and appropriate for family photographs. To Venus, it looked like the perfect funeral dress for an empire about to die. Her mother tapped at the door, peeking in with that bright, brittle smile she wore for society photographers. "Are you ready, darling? This is a big day for your father. Smile. Make him proud for once." Venus turned slowly, studying the woman who had spent her whole life telling Venus who she could never be. Too soft, too emotional, too inconvenient for their perfect image. For a second, Evelyn's smile wavered under her daughter's calm stare. "I'll make him proud," Venus said softly. "I promise." Downstairs, the ballroom pulsed with low chatter, clinking glass, and forced laughter. Politicians, city planners, and real estate sharks sipped champagne while photographers circled for glossy front-page shots. At the center, Charles Bennett stood like a king at his coronation. Custom-tailored suit, polished cufflinks, a smug grin that told everyone this was his world. And Venus, by his side, was just another piece of proof that the Bennett family was untouchable. He leaned close when she stepped up beside him. "Play your part, Venus. Smile pretty. Sign when I tell you to." Venus met his eyes and gave him exactly what he asked for, a sweet, obedient smile. Then she slipped her phone into the inside pocket of her blazer. The timer on her cloud upload ticked down to 0. One by one, the partners arrived at the long, gleaming table to add their signatures to the final contract. Her father's voice carried across the hall, polished, charming, full of promises that would never be kept. He thanked everyone for trusting the Bennett legacy, the same legacy that Venus's recordings would shred to pieces in a matter of minutes. When it was her turn to sign, Venus stepped forward. Her father handed her the pen, fingers brushing hers just long enough for his grip to tighten. A quiet threat, masked as fatherly control. "Don't screw this up, Venus," he whispered under the polite applause. She didn't flinch. She signed her name in perfect cursive, her heart beating steady beneath her ribs. Then she looked up, locking eyes with the cameras as they flashed. Somewhere behind the layers of polite applause, her mother watched, smile frozen, but eyes sharp with suspicion, as if she could sense that something was slipping out of her hands. Venus stepped back, letting the final signatures roll on. A server offered her a glass of champagne, the same drink her parents had used to toast deals that destroyed lives. She raised it halfway to her lips, just long enough to whisper to herself, "It's time." In the back corner of the room, her journalist friend lifted their phone, ready. Across town, a lawyer hit send on a folder that would land in prosecutors' inboxes before the last guest took a bite of dessert. Venus moved to the edge of the crowd, feeling her father's eyes following her. For years he'd made her small. Today she felt 10 feet tall. One by one, the screens behind the signing table flickered. The slideshow her father's team had prepared, glossy renderings of future skyscrapers, luxury homes, corporate spin, blinked once, twice, then went black. A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Her father frowned, tapping the mic to regain control. But Venus knew. The truth was already rolling. The final recording, the dirty deals, the bribes, her voice cutting through the lie. She turned back, facing her father fully for the first time in her life. No more pretending, no more polite mask. This was the last second before the mask shattered for good. For a split second, the entire ballroom froze. Glasses half raised, pens hovering over contracts, fake smiles frozen in place. The giant screens behind Charles Bennett flickered, static breaking through the polished slides of future condos and fake charity logos. Then Venus's voice filled the room. And as you can hear, my father Charles Bennett and my mother Evelyn Bennett have been paying city inspectors for years to approve unsafe buildings, forging tax statements, and bribing local officials. Here's just one of the meetings where they planned it all. The recording played crystal clear. Her father's unmistakable laugh, her mother's crisp, cold voice discussing payoffs, offshore accounts, hush money for whistleblowers. The words bounced off marble floors and gold chandeliers, each sentence landing like a hammer on the carefully polished lie they'd sold for decades. Charles lunged for the microphone, his face red with panic. "Turn it off! Cut it! Now!" he barked at his assistants, but the hotel staff just stared, wide-eyed, powerless. Phones went up like a wave, partners, reporters, even staff snapping photos, recording clips. In seconds, the secrets her parents buried for years spread beyond these walls. Evelyn stood frozen beside the stage, her manicured fingers trembling as she clutched her pearls. "Venus, what have you done?" she hissed, her voice just loud enough for Venus to hear. Venus met her mother's stare, the same cold stare that once reduced her to silence. Not anymore. She stepped closer, her voice low but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. "I gave them the truth, Mother. The truth you always thought you could bury with money." Charles barked orders at security guards to pull the plug, but it was too late. The recording was already live streaming from hidden phones. Venus's friend in the back corner made sure of it, uploading clips in real time. Outside the hotel, news outlets received timed leaks, bank transfers, wire fraud documents, confidential emails. The empire that once silenced everyone was now drowning in its own noise. One investor shouted, demanding an explanation. A local reporter pushed through the crowd, shoving a mic in Charles's face. "Mr. Bennett, do you deny these recordings? Do you deny the bribes?" But he couldn't speak. He just stood there, lips moving without sound, eyes darting to Evelyn, as if she might have a script to fix this. She didn't. Venus's hands shook slightly, not from fear, but release. Years of being told she was nothing, worthless, disposable, all gone in seconds. She felt taller than she ever had beside her father's shrinking figure. She turned to the stunned audience, raising her voice so it carried above the chaos. "My name is Venus Bennett. For years my family called me the black sheep, the disappointment, the worthless daughter. While they robbed this city blind, I won't stay silent for them anymore. Neither should you." Her father tried to reach for her arm, but she stepped back, refusing to flinch. Security finally moved, not for her, but for him. Hotel staff, lawyers, even a few guests she recognized as city council members slipped away, already dialing their phones. Venus knew what came next. Lawyers, subpoenas, frozen accounts, the fall of an empire built on secrets. When she finally left the stage, Venus didn't look back. She could hear her father's voice cracking, her mother's desperate pleas drowned out by reporters shouting for answers. She pushed through the doors into the bright daylight outside, the sun blinding after so many years in the dark. She felt the vibration in her pocket, a text from her lawyer. "It's done. They can't bury this." Another from her journalist friend. "The story's everywhere. They can't silence it." For the first time in her life, Venus felt the weight lift. Not because revenge made the pain vanish, but because she'd finally broken the cycle of silence that had poisoned her family for generations. And as she walked away from the collapsing empire behind her, she knew she wasn't running from anything anymore. In the days after the signing turned scandal, the Bennett's name vanished from marble plaques faster than Venus ever thought possible. The headlines were merciless. Billion-dollar fraud exposed by estranged daughter. News vans camped outside the mansion gates that once shut her out like a stray dog. Charles and Evelyn ducked cameras, hid behind high-priced lawyers, whispered through locked doors. But the empire Venus's toxic parents built on bribes and blackmail couldn't be saved by silence anymore. The city's investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Venus's recordings were so clear, her files so thorough, that prosecutors barely had to dig. Bank accounts were frozen, shady partners flipped to save themselves, and Venus's father's trusted lieutenants lined up for deals to testify in exchange for lighter sentences. Overnight, the Bennett family's glossy fortune turned into frozen assets and court summons. Venus watched it all unfold, not from the marble halls she'd grown up in, but from the tiny living room of her modest rented apartment, the same place she'd once hidden stacks of USB drives and scribbled revenge plans on sticky notes. She didn't feel like celebrating. She didn't feel the kind of explosive triumph that movies promised. What she felt was quieter, steadier. A release. A quiet, ironclad freedom that no contract or bloodline could ever erase again. Her phone buzzed constantly. Journalists begging for interviews, distant relatives pretending they'd always believed in her. Former family friends trying to spin her as the poor, confused girl manipulated by the press. Venus turned them all down. She didn't owe them her voice anymore. She'd used it exactly where it mattered. One evening, while the world debated the scandal she'd unleashed, Venus stood at the edge of her old neighborhood. She watched the mansion's grand gates through the windshield of her beat-up car. She could see the silhouettes of her parents moving behind the curtains, Charles pacing, Evelyn slumped on a couch in yesterday's silk robe. The kingdom they'd sacrificed everything for, now just another crime scene. She thought about knocking, about looking them in the eyes and asking if it was worth it, if trading her love for power made them feel untouchable in the end. But she knew the answers. She didn't need to hear their excuses or half-hearted apologies, offered too late, and only because they had nothing left to hold over her head. Instead, she drove away before they ever noticed she'd come. She didn't belong behind those gates anymore. She never had. And now, she was free enough to say she never would again. By the end of the week, her parents' lawyers tried to reach her, threats mixed with desperate promises. "Testify on our behalf," they begged. "Tell the world it was all a misunderstanding." Venus didn't answer. Instead, she sat in her lawyer's office with a quiet smile as he shredded each letter, one by one. Let them fight each other for scraps. She was done fighting for scraps of their love. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted her name when she stepped out with boxes of evidence under her arm. The same evidence that once weighed her down, now the reason she could walk with her head high. She didn't say much to the cameras. She didn't have to. The truth was louder than any statement she could make. The last thing Venus did before leaving that place for good was sign one final paper, the complaint that would strip her parents of their licenses, the trust funds they'd once lorded over her, and the voting shares she'd been forced to sign away. They thought disowning her would keep her powerless. Instead, it made her powerful enough to take everything they hid behind. The gavel dropped, the empire cracked, and Venus Bennett walked out of the shadows they built for her, not as their daughter, but as her own woman. Months passed, and Sophie's name slowly drifted out of the tabloids and breaking news banners. The scandal that once defined her family now clung to her parents alone. Charles and Evelyn Bennett, disgraced in courtrooms, fighting to keep the scraps of an empire that no longer belonged to them. Meanwhile, Sophie built something they could never touch. A life that was hers, and hers alone. She didn't rush into the spotlight. She didn't sign a book deal or sell her story to talk shows. Instead, she did something far more radical. She chose quiet. She moved into a modest townhouse across the river from the city that had once whispered behind her back. The walls were bare at first, but she filled them slowly with things that felt like freedom. Thrifted furniture she picked out herself, secondhand books stacked in mismatched piles, a tiny rescue dog named Milo who curled up at her feet while she worked late into the night. And work, she did. Sophie used what she'd learned, the loopholes, the lies, the contracts no one read until it was too late, and turned it into armor for people like her. She started small, helping tenants fight greedy landlords who cut corners and forged inspection reports, just like her father once did. Then she partnered with her lawyer and her journalist friend to launch a local foundation that offered free legal aid to whistleblowers and young people trapped in families that threatened them into silence. Every new case reminded her that the poison her parents spread wasn't unique. It lived in other boardrooms, in other living rooms, hidden behind expensive suits and forced smiles. But for every frightened voice that walked through her door, Sophie had an answer. Not just hope, but hard evidence and clear steps to burn it all down safely. Sometimes she still had to testify. More than once, she sat across from her father in cold marble courtrooms, watching him pretend not to recognize the daughter who destroyed his crown. He never said a word to her. Evelyn sometimes tried to catch Sophie's eye, but Sophie never looked back. She didn't need closure from people who were incapable of giving it. Instead, she found closure in the small victories that no headline would ever care about. The single mother who kept her home after a crooked landlord tried to push her out. The quiet 16-year-old who left her abusive father's house with Sophie's help and never looked back. Each win stitched her heart back together in places her family's betrayal had once ripped wide open. One evening, after a long day filing paperwork for a whistleblower who reminded her so much of herself at 17, Sophie sat on her back porch with Milo curled against her side. The city skyline glowed on the horizon, glittering with stories she would never be part of, scandals she no longer had to survive. She watched a breeze rustle the tiny garden she'd planted herself. Something alive, something growing because she'd chosen to care for it. She thought about her grandfather's words, still clear in her mind. If you ever need to protect yourself, don't trust anyone but the truth. It had nearly destroyed her, carrying that truth alone. But in the end, it had set her free. Not just from her toxic parents, but from every lie they'd built into her bones. For the first time in her life, Sophie felt no shame in her name. Not as the Bennett heir, not as the disgrace, just Sophie, a woman with scars she didn't have to hide, a voice too sharp to ever be silenced again. When Milo barked at the moon, she laughed, a real laugh, warm and unafraid. She lifted her cup of tea toward the stars, a quiet toast to everything she'd lost and everything she'd fought to find.